Cop, and I warmly welcome all of you to this side event. I see the room is still filling. We will go until 18:45. We have today a night session in one of the committees, starting at 7. For those of you who could stay, there will be some drinks and refreshments after the workshop, yes, outside. So you are very welcome to stay. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I think we have ahead of us 1.5 hours to discuss a very important topic with a very important team. I would say this is like a dream team. I couldn't think about a team that could reflect better the subject that we are going to discuss today, which is the synergies between the CBD and the Cites in the context of the post-2020 global biodiversity strategy. Something that the EU, the European Union, and its member states is very attached to. I had the pleasure and the opportunity to attend the last CBD Cop in Egypt, where this was planned, discussed, advanced, and we are all parties intensively working towards building this post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will guide globally the fight against biodiversity decline. And of course, as it was mentioned, I think by the CITES Secretary General, in her introductory speech to the COP, I think she was referring, if I'm not mistaken, it was her, to the global assessment published by IPBES, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has hit the headlines across the world, I think, because it has been an alarming signal that we have to take action to revert the biodiversity decline. It says, IPBES, that nature is declining at a rate that is unprecedented, that there are 1 million species that are at the risk of or threatened with extinction. And well, this is one aspect of the whole biodiversity discussion, the species extinction, but is one that also is very related to the work that we are doing here in CITES to try to combat unsustainable international trade of endangered species. I think I will not go too much longer in my introductory words. I think you are probably all of you familiar on how important this debate is, and here is about exploring how CITES, the CITES community can contribute to the debate, to the work on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and how CITES can also benefit from this global process of biodiversity that is ongoing. So that's an important subject, and we have, as I said, a dream team that I will be introducing one by one a bit later. But the first thing that I will want to do is to show, we have a member of the dream team that is not here with us, but was so kind of sending a video message of 5 minutes, and is an important person that probably all of you know, who is Basile Havre from Canada, who is the co-chair of the open-ended working group established to bring forward under the CBD post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And I would like to put this video because I think it sets the scene very well in just 5 minutes of what we want to discuss. So,
good morning. My name is Basile Van Haal, and I'm one of the co-chairs, along with Francis Ogwal from Uganda, of the open-ended working group. Together, we're leading the preparation of a new framework for the CBD for the period 2020 to 2030. I regret not being able to join you. Your work is important to both Francis and I, to your country, as most parties to both the CBD and CITES, and to the broader community as well. First, I would like to give you a quick overview of how the CBD works and why we're looking forward to increased cooperation and coordination between these two conventions, and with several others, such as UNFCCC and the UNCCD. The CBD Biodiversity Framework has three objectives. First, the conservation of biological diversity. Second, the sustainable use of its component. And lastly, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefit arising from the utilization of genetic resources. The CBD 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature, has been set so we can develop targets for each decade. This way, we can adjust and discuss progress as we work toward to achieve the 2050 vision. In a number of cases, those targets rely on the work carried out by other conventions such as CITES, like the UNFCCC convention. The CBD Biodiversity Framework also set objective and implementation agreement that transform those actions into results. I believe that in identifying synergies and co-benefits between convention and working together, we will ultimately maximize our chance to achieve our collective vision. One good example are the ongoing discussion on how a requirement for increased collaboration across borders for wildlife management could also be useful to the UNCMS. A few weeks ago, I was delighted to be part of the Biodiversity Convention in Bern, Switzerland, where signatories of the Rio Conventions and several other agreements met for the first time to discuss how we can work together to reach our common goal. This set of positive and collaborative tone for a new global approach for the environment. For many, including myself, this discussion was an eye-opener. We could all see the exponential benefits of supporting each other to meet a common objective. This type of collaborative action can go well beyond administrative measures like reporting to how global priorities are set. I echo the statement made recently by the UN Deputy Secretary General, in which he noted that each biodiversity-related convention has a unique role and mandate, but collectively, they provide a global strategy for arresting the loss of biological diversity that is critical to attaining the Sustainable Development Goal. We're now moving toward the end of the current 10-year cycle and are entering into negotiation for a new set of global biodiversity targets for 2020 to 2030. We're keen to work with you and invite you to take this important opportunity to share your perspectives so that the next biodiversity framework benefit from our collective strengths. In the current cycle, from 2010 to 2020, the first objective of the convention, conservation, has received the most attention. We've clearly heard from parties during regional consultation that there is a need for better results related to the other two objectives of the convention, including the focus of the CITES, sustainable use. CITES has a dual objective, to protect species from sustainable trade while enabling sustainable trade. As you may have heard, the recent IPBES assessment identified unsustainable trade as a key threat to species. It has been widely recognized that CITES stand at the intersection between trade, the environment, and development. It also evidenced that CITES, in implementing its vision of ensuring that all international trade is legal and sustainable, is dealing with a direct driver of biodiversity loss. CITES can share that experience and how it is used to understand underlying drivers of biodiversity loss to help design an effective post-2020 biodiversity framework. CITES has a proven track record of being effective in taking species listing decisions and implementing them domestically and globally. CITES is a finely tuned machine, and this is largely due to your collaborative spirits and work over many years. So in addition to the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the CITES process, it may merit some thoughts into designing a metric that will demonstrate CITES' contribution to sustainable use in general and to conservation globally. This in turn could be a very powerful tool for greater investment in CITES. And in fact, I think the global biodiversity community will support you in this initiative. I encourage you to continue to foster cooperation among the biodiversity conventions. I would like you to invite you to share your perspective among each other's and with myself and Francis, so we can capture your idea and find synergies between our work and yours to broaden our understanding and inform our post-2020 discussion for the future of biodiversity. I am deeply thankful for your time and energy that you will take to consider and discuss this question I have raised. I look forward to receiving your perspective and sharing them with the biodiversity world. Thank you.
Yes, I think Basile deserves a clap even if he's not here. We are very grateful for him to record this. Of course, next week there is an important meeting in Nairobi of the Open-Ended Working Group, and therefore I guess he's very busy preparing it. Basile, in his introduction, he was also hinting about concrete elements that CITES can contribute to this post-2020 global biodiversity framework, with a metric that can demonstrate progress on what the achievements of CITES are in terms of sustainable trade and combating unsustainable trade. So, with this introduction and with these words from Basile, I will give the floor to our panel to make one introductory speech of 2-3 minutes for each of them, and then I will open the floor also for comments from the participants, and I will also put some questions to the floor. So I will start with Carolina Cáceres, who is Director in Environment and Climate Change Canada, and of course we all know her because she has been an outstanding chair of the Standing Committee during the last 3 years. Carolina, please.
Hi. Did not expect to be the first. Okay, so thank you, Jorge, and thank you, friends. So indeed, I am Carolina. I'm from Canada. And as you can see, my colleague Basile is also from Canada. So Canada is placing a lot of importance on activities in the biodiversity realm. We as Canadians feel very strongly about the conservation of biodiversity, or nature, as we like to talk about it with our friends and our colleagues and our Canadians. Canada's placing a lot of emphasis on the development of the post-2020 biodiversity strategy. We think it's a really important milestone event that we are going to be happening in the next years, and the release of the IPBES report and the really clear message it gave about both direct and indirect drivers, we feel is a really good product in terms of being able to structure our consideration of what exactly is causing the biodiversity loss that we are all trying to prevent. And so from that context, I look at what we do in CITES from within that context. So I'm looking at what we're doing in CITES from within the context of the drivers. And so as Basile even mentioned in his introductory remarks, one of the drivers that was identified was unsustainable use. And as we all know, the main goal of CITES is to prevent unsustainable use, so to support sustainable trade and to ensure that unsustainable wildlife trade does not threaten species. And for me, as I mentioned in my opening remarks for this COP, one of the biggest values that CITES can bring is that it's an action-oriented convention. It has some fairly concrete obligations and some fairly immediate actions that are required of parties. And so implementing those actions, we've learned a lot of lessons. We've had almost 45-year history of learning the lessons of how to engage multilaterally in a very concrete way to try to ensure the sustainability of trade. And so I think there's some lessons that we can pick up from that we could offer to the global biodiversity framework. On the other side, what I value in the work that's being done under the CBD in the creation of the global biodiversity framework is its comprehensiveness. It is trying to create a structure to capture some of the complexity around the various interactions that result in biodiversity loss. And those are hard to understand, and they're therefore challenging to address. But it's important, I think, to recognize that complexity. And so by tackling unsustainable trade, so by tackling a particular driver of biodiversity loss, but trying to situate it into the complexity of all the drivers of biodiversity loss, this is where I think the CBD and the CITES can mutually benefit. And so that would be the ideas I put forward for discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for your introductory words and for bringing the element of complexity, because it's indeed a very important one in the context of what we are discussing of biodiversity loss. I should have mentioned at the beginning that the CITES Secretary General has excused herself because there is a budget committee at the moment, and I think we should all understand that that's an important discussion that she has to attend. But she told me that if she can, she will join us at the end, towards the end of the side event, to say a few words. So our next panelist is Sol Guerrero Ortiz, is coordinator of the CITES Scientific Authority in Conavio in Mexico. Mexico has been a champion of biodiversity for a number of years, and they organized a very successful CBD COP in Cancun a few years ago. So we are very pleased to have you here, Sol. So please, if you want to make your initial reflections on this topic. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to be here. This is a very impressive table. Forgive me, sometimes I get starstruck, and it's going to be hard to follow after Carolina. Anyway, I agree fully with what she said, and we have to agree that CITES and CBD have two very big overlapping objectives, which are conservation and sustainable use. In Mexico, we believe sustainable use is definitely a key concept in all of this discussion, along with what we've called mainstreaming biodiversity for sustainable use and well-being, which is what was the topic at COP18, which was held in Mexico. And the way forward with this is to start seeing biodiversity as part of the solution for many of the problems that we are currently facing. And CITES and CBD should look forward to developing tools and strategies together to be able to address these both shared goals, and really the post-2020 biodiversity framework offers this opportunity to have inputs from other international conventions and to present a wider panorama of what can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sol. So our next speaker is Diane Claimi from the Multilateral Environmental Agreements and Law Division of UN Environment, an organization that of course is working a lot also in synergies among the multilateral environmental agreements. So thanks for coming, Diane, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. The EU is our great partner on synergies. I would like to first reiterate what the Executive Director of UN Environment Program mentioned at the inception of this COP, very COP. CITES is a convention, an instrument that works very well, and biodiversity has been highlighted globally with the IPBES global assessment that highlighted that we are on the brink of losing 1 million species. However, MEA's conventions related to biodiversity and the Rio Conventions are very important, working together to curb the loss in biodiversity. So collaboration, cooperation at the policy, data level are very important among these conventions in order to achieve that very important goals. Now, working with the CBD, you know, UN Environment is very supportive of the open consultative process that the CBD has laid out with the championship of the co-chairs. And we have supported some regional consultations, as well as the last consultation that took place with the conventions, Rio Conventions, and biodiversity and chemical related conventions that took place in Bern with a lot of you. And that led to really a very straightforward message for all the conventions that the strategies of the governing bodies and the goals of those conventions are important to be reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is why CITES has been one of the very first conventions that laid out its vision on post-2020, which is in front of all of us for consideration at this COP. And it's very important that it's reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in order to achieve effective curbing of loss of biodiversity through international trade that is sustainable and legal. And I think that is the main focus of this COP. And this is something that would really effectively drive biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and achieving other biodiversity goals. So at this point, I think I'll just stop here and then.
Thank you very much, Diane, for your comments. And we move on to the next panelist, who is Vincent Fleming, who is co-leader of the international team and head of the Scientific Authority for Fauna in the UK. Vincent is an expert with an impressive experience in CITES and other biodiversity matters. So thanks very much for joining us today, please.
Thank you, Chair, and for your introduction and invitation to speak here tonight. I was realizing, as people were speaking before me, that the more you move to the left, the fewer things there are left to say in an introductory statement. But about myself a little bit, I work for a UK government conservation agency, providing scientific advice to government. I've worked in CITES for about 20 years and CBD for about 10, just after the last Aichi targets were adopted. And of course, they're both very different beasts. They work in very different ways. As Carolina has already said, CBD has a very broad focus. It's setting an agenda at global scale. It works through consensus and so on. CITES, of course, is quite different, a much narrower, targeted focus, more of a regulatory regime, and our debates are often quite different too. Having said that, of course, I think there's a lot in common. As Basile said, sustainable use is one of the key aims of CBD, and of course CITES and CBD have shared some common agendas, such as work on wild meat and sustainable wildlife management, and issues such as synthetic biology or synthetic DNA are also appearing in both conventions. I think, all I really want to say in the opening remarks really are the UK also sets great importance on the post-2020 framework. And I should say, actually here I'm speaking as an individual, so my comments are not necessarily UK government ones. And I think if you've been engaged with the debate on the post-2020 framework at all, a lot of the talk is about achieving transformational change. That we really need to make massive changes to society if we are to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. And I think if we're going to do that, then we need, as Carolina has alluded to be tackling the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. Clearly, CITES focuses on one of the direct drivers, which is overexploitation, and seeking to tackle that. But I think we need to look at what lies behind that. And I think some of the issues Sol pointed out are issues like mainstreaming. How do we integrate biodiversity considerations across all sectors of society? And of course, I think one of the key things you notice about these kind of meetings is we talk to ourselves, basically. We're all a community that has got broadly similar goals. We come from environment ministries, conservation agencies, conservation NGOs, but in CITES we also have a good representation of trade bodies. But I think really if we are going to transform society and achieve the long-term strategic vision that CBD sets out for us, we really have to face up to this challenge of how do we wider integration of biodiversity into other sectors. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Being very important consideration, mainstreaming and integration into other sectors. Susan Lieberman is Vice President of WCS. I'm sure many of you know Susan.
I probably don't need this, but is it on? Is it on?
Yes,
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I don't know if we're the dream team or not. You put a lot of pressure on us, but everybody's part of the dream team because everyone really needs to be involved in this whole CBD post-2020 negotiation. As Vin said, I'll try not to repeat anything that's been said, except why is this so important? Why does it matter now? The parties to CBD, which are every party that's here minus maybe one, the parties are going to be adopting a global biodiversity framework that is going to guide biodiversity activities for the next decade and probably beyond. And it will drive funding by donor agencies, donor governments, etc., for the next decade and beyond. It is extremely important. I was at the Nagoya negotiations, several of you were as well. We don't see the synergies there with CITES, and we see targets there that, you know, some of them are pretty clear and some of them are, what is that supposed to be anyhow? And governments say, well, let's not change anything, we haven't delivered these, but actually what does this really mean anyhow? So this is, without going into all those details, this is an extremely important opportunity to be bold and say there are things to keep, but there are things to change, and let's look at it in a very bold way. I was lucky enough to be at the Barron meeting that's been mentioned, and it was really interesting to see the kind of conversations between the different multilateral environment agreements, but looking specifically at CITES, specifically that the issues of sustainable use, ensuring that species that may become threatened do not become further threatened and are used sustainably, as well as the illegal trade issues, and the illegal trade in both Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 species, of course. It's extremely important. The illegal trade issues are reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and I think it's important to look not only at the Aichi targets, but at the UN SDGs and see how elements of what all of us deal with in CITES, how they're reflected in the SDGs, and how indeed they could be reflected in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. One of the, I don't want to say flaw, one of the interesting elements of the SDGs is the issue of illegal wildlife trade. In target 15.7, to get wonky with you, is only under land. It's only for terrestrial species. For marine species, what the heck? And I don't think that was the intention at the UN level, but that's the result. So I think that as you, the parties, and the rest of us other stakeholders work to negotiate the post-2020 framework, it's important on the one hand to reflect the goals of CITES and both sustainable use but also combating illegal trade, which is a threat to species but is also a threat to sustainable development. There is no question about that. And I think it's also important that these issues are reflected both terrestrially and marine. We'll talk about sustainable use and stopping trafficking of terrestrial species, but we also need to look at whatever targets are adopted in terms of fisheries, in terms of sustainable use and legal use of the marine environment, and ensure that what we're talking about in a CITES context is reflected there. And finally, I think it's important to see that somehow we don't see a disconnect between CITES and CBD. I've talked to some governments who say, well, I do my NBSAP under CBD of CITES, but it's separate ministries, separate people. We don't talk to each other. Now, I think it's important that they're integrated, and what governments do to deliver on their CITES obligations and commitments should, if in some essence, count towards their CBD target delivery as well. Make sure that there are synergies not that are sort of implicit, but explicit in the post-2020, and I will leave it at that because I've probably gone on too long. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Very interesting. Of course, the link to the SDGs. We will come back to this because it's an important consideration. Guido Broekhaven. Sorry if I pronounce incorrectly your name. Head of Policy, Research and Developing in WWF. Thanks very much for accompanying us today. Please.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. This is the issue of collaboration, convergence, synergies is really a key issue for WWF, and that's why we're very glad to be here. Let me try and complement what's been said already before. IPBES has not only indicated that nature is in crisis, it's also very clearly indicated the interconnectivity between climate, the climate crisis, nature crisis, and the implications for development and the sustainable development goals. And in amongst the many things that we need to do to address these multiple crises, we've identified 4 key issues. One is we need to elevate the relevance of nature to the highest political level, so that really decisions are made at that high level and that nature is seen as relevant for integrated decision making. Secondly, we need to work towards a common set of goals and targets, and WWF has put forward the goal of bending the curve, which mentioned before, together with others, and we've suggested 3 global targets. One is zero habitat loss, the second one is 50% reduction of unsustainable consumption, the third one is zero species extinction, all by 2030 as a stepping stone towards living in harmony with nature by 2050. Once you've created that political space at the highest level, once you've got your common goals, then the third aspect is collaboration. Collaboration is necessary, of course, because we're all working on similar issues that are interconnected, and CITES, it's been said before, is absolutely essential for achieving those common goals. CITES is relevant for the consumption and species extinction targets at a global level. Now, and then fourthly, you need to capitalize on the opportunities that are there. The opportunities that are in front of us are the post-2020 framework, but they're also in the climate change sphere. The NDCs that need to be updated next year. There we can look at how nature-based solutions can become more relevant. And indeed, as we mentioned, also the SDGs. The SDGs related targets, the targets related to biodiversity, they will be up for renewal in 2020, and we need to make sure that that happens in a way that's consistent with the post-2020 framework. So, when there's a crisis, people and institutions band together. Nature is in crisis, so we do need to really collaborate, work together. Collaboration needs to become the norm and not an issue for discussion. I'll leave it to that.
Thanks very much, Guido, for these introductory words. I think very important links that you have established with climate, with sustainable consumption, very inspiring. And we have finally Anastasia Timoshina from Traffic. You all know Traffic, I'm sure, because it's very strongly linked with CITES. He's Senior Program Coordinator on Sustainable Trade. Thanks a lot, Anastasia, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting us. So I'm here speaking with 2 hats, and one is me as Traffic, and another one is representing the Collaborative Partnership on Sustainable Wildlife Management, which is a voluntary partnership of 14 international organizations with broad remits at looking into sustainable use and conservation of species. One thing we've recently done in an open consultative workshop is try and strike a conversation about what future for sustainable wildlife management may look like beyond 2020, which inevitably took us to conversation about post-2020 targets. Our conversation was this workshop, which we have proceedings of, and it's actually an information document of this conference of parties as well, looked at a number of challenges that sustainable wildlife management is currently facing. We've talked about a range of issues from human-wildlife conflict to sustainability of harvest and hunting and trade to food security and livelihoods. And then we did spend a significant amount of time trying to think about what the practical targets could be that we could offer to the world, so to say, for consideration as an input. Most time we spent talking about targets on trade and use, and it's very hard, as everybody reflected, talking after everyone else. So something that I can contribute, I think, is by saying what we've been looking at is, one, how can global biodiversity target post-2020 reflect both the illegal wildlife trade and sustainability of trade that leads to the benefits in human well-being. And I think Susan did a really great introduction to why that's important and what CITES can do. And then also how inclusive it is of all species. You pointed out marine species, I'll point out flora because I'm very sensitive to flora issues, but it goes obviously beyond it as well. When you started this presentation, you asked us to think how CITES parties can contribute and how can CITES contribute? How can the post-2020 process benefit CITES? I think for me, from this thinking about the targets on use and trade, addressing illegal wildlife trade and also supporting sustainable trade, CITES can provide a lot of really useful metrics and very practical mechanisms. In our meeting we thought about mechanisms like traceability and non-detriment findings and how much downlisting of species within the appendices, which is based on sustainable management, could be used as useful metrics for progress. What can post-2020 framework, if it was accepted and there was a target in there, or targets in there that cover wildlife trade and use do for CITES? I think that would really elevate the issue of wildlife trade and use, and it would provide this global ambition that hasn't actually been signed off on before. And that would provide, I think, support to implementing CITES and global commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sase, for sharing your experience and your work on this matter. And now we have heard the introductory words from all panelists, and while there are a lot of good elements and concepts that have been shared with us already, so I was thinking how to. I was building on some of the elements that you have shared with us, this idea of that we have to work together, and everybody agrees with this, but this, even if the general objectives of the conventions can, on paper, reinforce each other, if we want really to work together to make something happen on the ground, we have to really take action to ensure that this is operationally coordinated and operationally embedded. And we have at this COP the CITES strategic vision for the next 10 years, from 2020 to 2030, that will be follow up with a process where these goals that are there, these strategic goals that are embedded a lot on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the, of course, the objectives of CITES and the remit of CITES, will be made operational through a number of more concrete indicators and so on. How I would put a question to the panel, and for whoever wants to reply, how do you think this process is this really the process that will deliver this link with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, this operational link that will basically get together the CITES embedded operationally in this post-2020 global biodiversity framework? Who wants to have a reflection on this? Yes, please. Diane.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a CITES expert, but I can say one thing, an experience from working with mechanisms, coordination mechanisms at the national level, and working with the inspiring SDGs. As Susan just said, there is a target under 15 that talks about poaching and illegal poaching, but under 14 there's another one also on illegal fishing, but managed by FAO. This doesn't really encompass the full scope of what CITES does. And that is why the vision that CITES lays out for the post-2020 could be comprehensive enough into considering for the post-2020. Also, I think that in order to address those systemic issues that we talked about, and the direct drivers, the indirect drivers, I think illegal trade is also has indirect drivers. It's illegal fishing and consumption patterns in other regions. It also drives illegal acts and illicit trade. So I think also that linkage between the Aichi Target 2 and the Aichi Target 12 was not strongly interlinked in the last decade, and maybe worth considering in the next post-2020 biodiversity framework, as well as looking into maybe a specific target that really addresses the full scope of sustainable use and legal trade together in one target, maybe could be considered for monitoring.
Okay, thanks very much, Jan. Any other reflection on this vein? Yes, Susan, please.
Yeah, just a brief reflection. I think one way of getting the synergies is not so much maybe at the negotiation level, but at the national level. How many governments do they have their CBD focal point meet with their CITES management and scientific authority on these issues? You don't have to raise your hand and answer, but I think looking at and including their fisheries ministries and including their agriculture ministries, but from the CITES perspective, how many CITES management and scientific authorities are engaged with this? And I think that's one way to create those synergies, because they have a perspective of CITES, but there are quite a few governments. In CITES for Appendix 2 species, it's not only about preventing extinctions. I hope that the CBD post-20 framework doesn't just talk about preventing extinctions of species, because that's giving up. We don't want them to just not go extinct. We want them to have healthy roles in their ecosystem, which is in the CITES treaty. So I think if we can, governments and other stakeholders can work, that those, even in large NGOs, it's not always the people who do CITES who do CBD, maybe because in WCS it's all the same people, it might be easier. But I would just encourage governments, management and scientific authorities when they go home to engage with their CBD focal points. I think it could go a long way. Thank you.
The government representatives.
Speaking of governments.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, just I think ages ago, Hank Jenkins, I don't know if he's here, he said something like synergy begins at home, and that's very true. I think synergy, if you're going to make different conventions work together, it's got to happen within the country. It's fine to talk about doing it at multilateral level and in negotiations, but Sue said rightly, implementation is where things matter, and I think that's, potentially, the opportunity with the post-2020 framework is maybe to have, we don't necessarily know how the target's going to be structured yet, but I think Anastasia, you said that the targets didn't, or you were saying that, the targets didn't really work for CITES. You looked at the Aichi targets at the moment, you've got a bit of target 4 maybe, sustainable production and consumption, you've got target 6, which is about unsustainable use of marine species predominantly. You've got target 11, reducing extinction. But there's no neat slot where, to me, CITES fits in. And I think then that becomes a barrier in national implementation, because if you have an MBSAT where you're trying to address all the targets, CITES, I think, potentially falls through the gaps. Whereas a broader target addressing overexploitation or something similar along those lines would enable CITES to have a clear position, and then of course if things are in targets in national plans, you then have reporting on them and measuring progress and so on, and also better able to capture resources. So I think that's a lesson maybe for Carol.
Yes, Carolina, please.
Yeah, maybe I'll just echo what Vin just said about that, because I also attended the Bern meeting, and as part of that conversation we were talking about the structure of how you're going to structure this goal, and someone, it might have been a colleague from FAO, mentioned that you would want to create a structure where it's an invitation to see yourself, so to speak, and I think that's what Vin was alluding to, is if you create targets that are focused on issues like drivers, then there's a natural fit where you can see what the actions of CITES are trying to achieve within the context of trying to reduce or eliminate that driver. So that's one way you could consider offering an approach to designing a post-2020 framework.
Thank you. Any other comment? Start thinking about your questions, because I'm going to go back to you very soon. Yes, Sol, please, and then Guido.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. I think it starts at the national level, but also I'd like to bring up the topic of mainstreaming again, because mainstreaming is not just within the sectors, but also across different stakeholders and across society. Luckily in Mexico, and I'm pretty sure most of you know him, Ezequiel Benitez is our head of scientific authority. He is substagiaire currently, and he is also IPE's focal point. So having key people, perhaps not all the responsibility should fall on one person, but having some key people can help synergies a bit more, you know, like really help people from different sectors or different backgrounds understand the importance of bringing all of these aspects together. IPES has played a great role in giving us the global assessment, really getting the information out there. I think there was a big shock when it came out, and it got a lot of people moving. We still obviously have a lot of issues with the people from fisheries. In the history of Mexico, fisheries used to be part of environmental ministry, and then it got taken out and put in with agriculture and rural development. So we've had a lot of clashes with them, but we are looking forward, and we're trying to move forward with them and have collaboration with Cites listings and such. We also have a interministerial committee that analyzes all Cites proposals and documents together. We have not always worked at 100% agreement or anything, but I think establishing little committees like this could also help improve synergies and collaboration with others.
Yes, thank you. So the link to governance, how governance structures can influence function and can stimulate or hinder this collaboration, this working together. Guido, please.
Yeah, I can nicely build on that one. We've heard about the Burn workshop. They came up with a whole list of tools and mechanisms that potentially can be used to improve synergies. There's documents produced by UNEP WCMC that provide guidance and ideas, and some of these are being taken up, but not nearly as fast as we would like to see it happen. And I think what is really important is to realize that probably people and institutions in this environment sphere do not behave very differently than people and institutions in other spheres, and to become a bit more explicit about the dynamics of how institutions operate vis-a-vis each other, how individuals operate within institutions. And I think two issues are really essential there. One is ownership, and that's why this global framework with these globally agreed targets and goals where people can and institutions can recognize themselves. Okay, this is something for me. That's one part of the equation. The other one then is of course accountability. How do you hold these institutions accountable for these their contribution to these globally agreed goals and targets?
Thank you very much. So, one question from the floor at this moment, please. Please introduce yourself.
Alice Hughes. I'm here representing China Biodiversity Conservation Green Development Foundation. Now, we're in a global meeting talking about a global framework. All the speakers are from either North America or from Europe. Most of the world's population is in Asia. Most of the world's biodiversity is in tropical regions. How do we mainstream this dialogue and better include these regions? Because unless we consult with those countries, unless we have goals and targets which are made with those countries, we are going to fail. Now, I'm based in China. In Beijing alone, we have at least 3 parallel separate groups that are working on the post-2020 framework. And we can't have the intersection between those dialogues and frameworks within Beijing. Now, we've got challenges within each of those countries, but unless we do a whole lot better, we're going to have another set of action targets which are not going to work. So how are we going to address this and have a set of targets that are truly global and that do have ownership across the world, especially in the parts of the world where we're seeing the most development and the most potential loss? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thanks very much for your question. Who wants to address it, please?
I mean, I'm UNEP, but not CBD, but I think that I know time is running and we have less than a year to articulate what needs to be integrated into that very, very challenging framework. Next month, I mean not next month, next week, we have a very important meeting in Nairobi, which is the open-ended intercessional working group to discuss the first draft of that framework, articulating all the submissions that were presented to the chairs of the Convention Biological Diversity. So, I mean, all what I can say is just make sure that the local communities you are talking about are introducing those important elements and considered before the next meeting in February that will take place and before the roadmap ends in China in 2020. So that's the thing that I would advise.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your question. I'd like to bring to mind that even though in CITES Mexico is part of North America, in CBD Mexico is part of GRULAC. So we do work closely with other Latin American countries, and also on an idea that I think came from different groups, but that Mexico really pushed in CBD was a like-minded mega-diverse country group. And as you know, there are very many countries from Asia and Africa within this group. So I think we just have to keep promoting synergies, work with South-South cooperation, and involve as many people as we can, and always look beyond your region. And groups like the like-minded mega-diverse country group definitely is a good example of how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, yes, Sue, please.
Yeah, a brief comment. And yes, I'm guilty as charged of being from the global north, but I would stress, at least for WCS, where we work in more than 60 countries around the globe, only 2 of which are in the global north. I'm not representing my views, and certainly not those of the United States, but the views of all our country programs around the world. So I think it's important. But even more important is when we look at biodiversity loss, the drivers of biodiversity loss are not all in the global south. The global north, the footprint, the purchasing of timber and everything else, and all the consumption in Europe, North America, etc., is responsible for a great deal in fisheries, I don't want to forget fisheries, is responsible for a great deal of the biodiversity loss. And the burden, therefore, is not only on the mega-diverse countries, but is a global issue that governments need to look at globally. And I think one of the problems in CBD has been, it's all about what are you doing at the national level. So we're in Switzerland, I'm not picking on Switzerland, it should not only be what Switzerland is doing for Swiss biodiversity, but what are the consumption patterns, the investment patterns, the ODA of Switzerland, how is that affecting biodiversity globally? So I think it's a global problem, but the global north is not, shall we say, no pun intended, off the hook. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think a very pertinent question. I think there has been quite an effort to have an inclusive process within the CBD to make really the global framework really global and that works for everyone, and that covers the 3 objectives of the CBD framework. So let's see. Next week is an important meeting. We will hear from them. Another question from the floor, please. I have to ask you, please, to come here to use the microphone because otherwise we're not here. Thank you very much. Thank you. We are limited by technology. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good evening. Martin Hitziger from the CITES Secretariat. I have a bit of a provocative question, maybe. I find this dialogue extremely abstract, and I would like to ask, why can a strategy on synthesis and synergies not become more operational? I would like to very shortly give an example. There is a very operational project funded by the UK in a country that I'm involved in. I'm not going to say which country. And we are trying to have a very operational collaboration between CITES and CBD in that country. And we find the progress a bit stony because TORs of the middle level people, they are very subject specific. The interest of people at the ground is taking the benefit wherever they can. Can WHO help here? Can CITES help there? Can CBD help there? And anyway, we want anything. On the high level, I see the will for synergy, but I don't see it operationally feasible in the middle grounds. There is two boxed in career pathways and education pathways. The targets by which people work in their careers are very much focused. And often enough, after 10 years in that position, the mere fantasy and imagination of why they would want to collaborate and what that would exactly mean and how to exactly do things differently to how they did them in comparison to how they did that before, that's very challenging. And I feel rather than having only an abstract discussion, we would also need to consider taking in tasks relating to how offices, careers, etc. are being structured.
Thank you very much. I think this ties in with some of the comments that some of you made about, I think it was Vin who has been participating in both Cites and CBD. CBD being generally much broader discussions and Cites much more operational and how to bridge this. And this is where I was trying to ask in my question whether this process that is in Cites at the moment as a follow-up to the Cites strategic vision, is this able to deliver this bridge that is needed to make this link operational, or do we need something else? Do we need to work more closely? Any reflection? Are we able to bring these communities together to a ground that they can understand each other on the operational level? Yes.
I'm just gonna say from a personal experience, because I worked at the national, regional, and global level. I can say with all honesty, synergies is only felt when you work on the ground. In a wetland where you have CBD, CITES, CMS issues working in one landscape. You're bringing in different ministries, although they are in conflict sometimes, but to talk to each other. But synergies is also guided globally by the conventions, and it needs to start there by the secretariats. We know from the number of resolutions that emerged over 15 years, there's still one today on the agenda here, meaning that cooperation and collaboration is important, but it needs to be implemented. And unless you have a joint program that is funded with money there, you don't have collaboration really actually happening. So it is actually one of the results that we, two days ago, we had a side event on cooperation and collaboration supported by the government of Switzerland and the EU, because they believe in synergies and how effective it can be on the ground with anacondas, for example, in Switzerland. The DART tool, the data reporting tool, is something that has been requested through resolutions under the CBD, which is a modular reporting tool, a data space for national information use in order to respond to reporting under the conventions. It's under development because of the support from the EU and Switzerland, and we are now testing it, and it will be hopefully available very soon for countries to feel it and to share information for reporting.
Mm-hmm. So we need really operational collaboration on the ground, but we also need, I have heard, to ensure that CITES work features in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and we can recognize ourselves there, so that this drives also political attention, drives working together, drives the funding that is behind the, hopefully, the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So all these elements. Carolina, please.
Thank you, Jorge. And I think you're getting to the point I was going to make, and I think, and this is just my opinion, I think sometimes we get a little caught up in the synergies discussion and we're talking about different things. So from my CITES perspective, the synergies that have worked the most effectively have been when we're focusing on a particular outcome. And so if CITES parties have recognized that we want to achieve an outcome with a particular group of species, and the Ramsar Convention or the CMS Convention or FAO are working in that same sphere, then we look for those relationships because we understand what you're calling operative or practical outcome we're trying to achieve. And those are strong relationships, and we value them very much. The relationship I think we're trying to talk about here under the idea of forming a global strategy is more about the relationship of having a global perspective that is aligned and moving in the same direction. And so this is the frame that we're trying to create, where all of the pieces that we've created, all the different multilateral environmental agreements that we are party to, are all demonstrating how collectively we're trying to achieve conservation. Exactly, global goals. And so for me, that in and of itself, even though it might not be something that I would take to my local community conservation woodlot and say, now we can work on something, while that may not necessarily come down in that same direction, it still speaks to an ethic, a value that we share, and then that's a value that I can put forward as a citizen to my governments, to my colleagues, and say, this is a value that we've shared globally, so let's do our pieces of this global value. And so to some degree, when we have these synergies conversations, I think sometimes we're talking about both those things, and for me personally, I think both have value, and they don't have to all be the be-all and end-all. They don't have to do everything.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, please.
Thanks. I think for me, wildlife trade in itself is such a synergistic thing. Just being able to talk about it is cutting across different taxes, cutting across different geographies. It's a domestic thing. It's an international thing. One thing I think one of the obstacles that I see and that needs to be addressed is invisibility of wildlife trade. I know it's not invisible in this forum because this is what this is about. But being in CBD conversations, thinking about sustainable production and consumption, natural capital, shockingly or surprisingly, wildlife trade and the use of wild species is just not reflected, and it's not part of those big narratives. So what can be done to sort of unhide the value of wildlife trade? And I think, I different events, different conversations, you keep hearing about this. What are the benefits generated from wildlife trade? How can they be recognized and also reconciled with these targets? Could there be a target that speaks about trade, but also reflecting on the benefits to people, and how beneficial could that be back to CITES? Because global framework could actually be talking directly about the benefit flows and improved well-being, improved incomes. So I think this issue of hidden wildlife trade and the fact that it's hidden from the public eye is something that I would very much hope the target that is global, that is in the public eye, would try to address and trickle down.
Thank you very much for these reflections. Another question.
Thank you. Mark Jones from Born Free Foundation. This is a really interesting discussion. And it kind of follows on from what's just been said. We hear a lot about CITES being the convention that's very much focused on promoting sustainable use and dealing with illegal wildlife trade. And we also hear somebody at the beginning mentioned a quote from I think the speeches earlier on in at the beginning of the convention, that CITES is an instrument that's working really well. But when you look at the IPBES global assessment, and I'll quote from the press release, it says global goals for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be met by current trajectories, and transformative changes are needed to restore and protect nature. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. So if CITES is the primary mechanism for achieving sustainable use, what are the transformative changes that need to be happening within CITES in order for it to better achieve that goal?
Thank you. Anyone wants to address this point?
Well, yes, I'll offer a few comments, really. The the first thing is that not all wildlife trade is controlled by CITES, of course, is it? And it never will be. And even though there are many thousands of species in the appendices, that's probably still a very small fraction of all species in existence. So I think we also always have to remember that CITES can only do so much, and that an awful lot of how wildlife is managed or its exploitation is managed is going to be at national level or in other kind of fora such as regional fisheries management organisations. So we shouldn't forget that and focus and expect CITES to save the world by itself, because it has a fairly tight focus. I think, you know, some of the points that Anastasia made are quite important ones, really, about the value of wildlife to people, and it's not just necessarily a value of its consumptive use. There are non-consumptive uses as well, which are captured in the CBD's definition of sustainable use. But I think understanding the value is probably a good way to get the message through to people who are not necessarily that interested in conserving wildlife just for its own sake. So the UK government has recently announced this review by Professor Das Gupta, which is going to look at the links between biodiversity and economic development and so on. How much do we depend on biodiversity? And of course, we've seen lots in the ICPES assessments and so on. But I think that's an important point, that the more people value biodiversity in whichever way they choose to value it, whether it's just for its own existence or whether it's because it's providing material benefits of some kind, then I think the greater our opportunities of not only conserving biodiversity, but I think restoring it as well. And I think too often, maybe in CITES, you know, maybe globally, we talk in CITES about non-detriment findings, sort of saying let's do no harm. And that's good as a baseline, really, but I think our ambition for the future has clearly got to be better than that. We want species to recover, to have bigger, more viable populations, which of course, if that's the case, can then also provide these various benefits to people. So I think being able to value things in a number of different ways, I think is quite important to achieving that transformation.
Thank you. Thank you, Vin. More questions. We have this gentleman over there, please. May I ask you to come here because we have his microphone.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm Elisa BT, a delegate from Uganda. This is my first time to attend this convention, and I've been overwhelmed by what is going on. I really congratulate you. You are doing a great job. Now, on the issue of identifying partners, I realize you have academia and science institutions. I happen to come from academia. I would like to know how will you identify the various universities globally participate in this important process? And secondly, if I don't have an opportunity in the future to propose something, last year someone asked me if I could supply him with 2,000 earthworms. I said, earthworms? For what? So these are very useful in degrading waste by waste. And I went to my country, my ecosystem, ecosystems in Uganda. I looked for earthworms. I could not see them. Here I'm talking about below ground biodiversity. It seems we tend to focus on the above ground biodiversity and forget what's going on. When I was growing up, these earthworms were so many you could even step on them, but I can assure you they are no longer available. And yet, someone is now talking about buying earthworms, so it comes in free. So I don't know whether you have that, you have thought about that, especially in the tropics. I am not sure about in temperate countries, but earthworms play a very important role in soil aeration and breaking down organic matter to release nutrients. I happen to teach a course on biodiversity and sustainable development in my university. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution. So the role of scientists and academia also in the process, of course, the IPBES assessment that we are talking about is really driven by the latest scientific understanding. I don't know if any of the panelists want to comment on this matter, or we can give the floor to other ends. Sorry, I will move to the other side because I'm realizing that I will
So my name is Ana Maria Prieto. I'm from the Helmholtz-Zentrum Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany, and originally from Colombia. I have two specific questions. The first one is that the biodiversity framework has like a goal to make like an umbrella of environmental related organizations to reach the 2020 goals and to propose other ones. However, someone mentioned the drivers here, and I see like the number of organizations that you are addressing are very output oriented in the sense of the biodiversity loss, but not drivers oriented. And if we focus in the drivers, there's a lot of very important social and economic drivers that are behind the things that actually have to do with the matter of cities, like poaching and hunting. And I'm really, I wonder if there is any strategy to relate with social and economic organizations also to really, get into, involve those drivers. And the other question is like more an operative question, so, but also related to the drivers, because there are some drivers, very important, like habitat loss, that are not really the direct matter of cities, and actually is one of the main arguments that are used for a lot of opponents in cities against some proposals. It's okay, there are a lot of species that have habitat loss, habitat degradation, and a lot of things, but not really like a strong handling. And then that's not the matter of cities. Okay, that one can discuss that or not, but okay, let's say it's true. Then what is the strategy to develop information exchange regarding these species that are not really the focus of CITES because it's habitat loss, the real threat, to pass this information like the CBD or the IPBES in the global assessment. So to say, okay, we had in the last conventions the number of species that were not listed because it's not the direct matter of CITES, but the proponents have worries because there's a lot of habitat loss, so we pass that information to the IPBES for creating focus groups in some taxa. So is there any strategy to really make an operative exchange of information in that sense? So those were my
Thank you. Thanks very much for your contribution. Any reaction or thought about this reflection? CITES is a piece, but in the puzzle of biodiversity. So, yes,
yeah,
so
just
please.
a small reflection on that. I think you raised an important point in your second point. But CITES has never said that the only species that can be listed are those that where the primary or only threat is overexploitation, is international trade. And I think as scientists and governments look more and more at habitat loss and climate change, and those impacts are putting some species at far greater threat from international trade. In other words, because of climate change or because of habitat loss, species may not be able to sustain the same level of trade that they would have been able to sustain without the habitat loss, without the climate change, et cetera. So definitely from from that perspective, it's important for CITES, but also CBD, to see the multiple threats to species and ecosystems in a more holistic manner. But I think it's also important to remember in CITES, again, is not only about preventing species from going extinct. There's a clear clause in the CITES Treaty that you trade species at a level that's consistent with their role in their ecosystem. So you have to look holistically at the ecosystem of the species and therefore the habitat. And when governments issue non-detriment findings, et cetera, they need to look at what are all the threats to the species, not only trade. But I think it might be really interesting to get something in the post-2020 framework that talks about not just preventing species from going extinct, but maybe through sustainable use mechanisms, ensuring that species don't qualify for inclusion in the CITES appendices, or species can be downlisted or delisted through different mechanisms, not just preventing species from going extinct. But the short answer is, you raise an important point and it needs to be kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Guido, did you want to? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I absolutely agree. The drivers are essential to resolving the nature crisis, and many of the drivers are outside the environment sphere. We sometimes use the slogan, we need to make the nature-related conventions more powerful, and we need to make the powerful processes more nature-related and more nature-relevant. With that, I mean G7, trade processes, G20, etc., etc. And not only the government process, but also the other sectors, as in the business sector, for example. And there again, the joined-up approach in our narrative is really important. Also at a very practical level. We work a fair bit with companies, and the two messages that we get is, what do you want us to do? What is the target that we need to achieve? And secondly, we're hearing this from you, next day we're hearing that from somebody else, and then from somebody else again something else. One time it's related to trade of species, the other time it's related to sustainable management. So also there, a joint approach towards those sectors, for example through the science-based initiative, science-based targets for nature initiative, is very useful to achieve our goal.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, yes,
I'll just
please.
reflect really quickly on the social science question, because I think you're right. I think social sciences play a really important role in resolving most of the drivers, or a lot of the drivers that are human-induced. We're often joking that actually all of us, all we're doing is working on behavioral change. We're trying to change the behavior of governments and private sector and consumers. So I think you're right. When we looked in what smaller drivers of unsustainable trade and use are, overconsumption or consumption patterns per se just come up frequently, and this is something that can be addressed and should be addressed. And for this, social sciences can borrow so much more than natural sciences, of course. So,
thank you. The point in the conversation that links to the reflection on mainstreaming from Sol earlier. May I come back? We have a bit more than 10 minutes, and may I come back to the question that Basil put at the beginning? So he was prompting the CITES community to reflect about a target, a metric, a goal, however you want to call it, so that we can see ourselves reflected in the post-2020 global framework, biodiversity framework. How this could look like, how this can, we have had some elements already in the discussion, but do you want, some of you want to make a pitch or how this would look like?
Nobody else is speaking. I'm sure everybody wants to. The pitch that I would make is related very much to obviously all we've discussed. I think you could have one target that ideally for me, we would have one target that looks simply on trade and use. You could split it into a target that's addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss if you wanted. You could speak in that target specifically about addressing illegal and unsustainable trade and use, and how that influences the benefits of human well-being. and you could have a second target that looks at benefits generated to conservation and human well-being and livelihoods from sustainable and legal trade, or you could have one that brings everything together. So in my ideal world, countries would sign up to this incredible target that really drives forward the conservation of wild species of fauna, flora, and I'm going to include the earthworms, and I'm also going to mention fungi because I have a lot of friends who would really champion that.
Thank you.
Friends who are fungi.
Any other reflection, any other idea at this stage?
Well, just one thing
Yes.
I've been thinking about is if somehow there were a target that says governments and other stakeholders commit to the effective implementation of CITES, however you define that. Then, when governments are implementing CITES through national legislation or whatever they're doing, they are delivering on the CBD target, and that is delivered through CITES. I mean, I'm not giving words to it, but some way, somehow, looking at the strategic vision of CITES, what is CITES trying to accomplish, and put that in the post-2020 and actually explicitly say that's delivered through CITES implementation. There aren't that many countries left that aren't CITES parties, so it might not be that controversial. Something on connectivity and migratory species delivered through CMS. Just, I'm thinking off the top of my head, but that's another way to look at it, and that forces the synergy because governments see, well, I have to report on my CITES implementation to CBD. Just a thought.
Thank
Probably
you,
a little
Sue.
radical, but-
Carolina, you wanted to intervene, please.
Yeah, well, you were talking about metrics, and so that reminded me that, I mean, we are, as parties to CITES, looking at adopting a new strategic vision, but we did have one from the past, and it had metrics, and those metrics are part of the implementation report that as parties we submit to CITES, and so I don't have a full perspective on what kind of target you want, because you might want to have broad targets with a number of metrics underneath it, or you might want to have these individual targets like the other speakers indicated. But I do think CITES has already, as a collective of parties, selected some metrics where they measure, or where we measure our progress towards the objectives and the vision we want to achieve. And so those could be part of the package of measuring progress towards the global things we want to achieve, because we've already committed to those.
Thank you. Guido, please. Yes.
Thanks. Within the post-2020 discussion, there's a lot of talk about what level of ambition. And speaking to Sue's point, ambition also relates to implementation. The Aichi targets have not been achieved, so we need to also really increase the ambition in terms of implementation. But then in terms of the sort of, let's say, the biophysical targets, we're very much supportive of targets that speak to what needs to be done rather than what can be done. Because if you only focus on what can be done, then you just slow the decline. But really you need to know what needs to be done to save what we've got. And that's why we are proposing zero loss of species by 2030 as one of the 3 headline targets.
Okay, thank you very much. Big, please. Yes.
Okay, I just want to speak on 2 things, and it's a personal experience. Why don't we take the model of SDGs? I mean, there's a target that strengthens governance systems and policy coherence in order to bring everything together, so globally. Monitoring those SDGs. I went to once one of the countries' SDG coordination mechanisms, and I found out that coordination mechanism that drives a sustainable development did not include any of the convention's representatives, neither the Ministry of Environment, telling me it was on SDG 6, water, and there's a strong biodiversity indicator in that goal. It told me everything, that the report that came out from that country, the national voluntary reviews, excluded anything on any monitoring mechanisms under the convention. So I would suggest, like, including in the global, the post-2020, anything that would encourage coordination mechanisms at the national level with SDG mechanisms, and also potentially support the synergies process being implemented as a target and not as a chapeau, because in the narrative it was not strengthened in the monitoring, but in the target that would be a better way to articulate collaboration and cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to, without going into details of what might be in any target, and kind of stimulated a bit by what Sue was saying about, giving a target for governments to do things on CITES. It struck me really that I think a lot of people look at the Aichi targets and they've been written or negotiated by governments, and people see them as being targets for governments. So why hasn't the government done X, Y, or Z? And I think if you take that approach, then the targets are never going to work. And I think it's a mainstreaming point, a view that really these targets should apply, I think Carolina was making this point too, should apply to all sectors of society. And I think if you do that, then communication and language matters. So for example, in the UK, we have been running a few workshops with businesses, with the private sector. I've seen them, trying to get them to think ahead to the post-2020 framework and how things might go. But we started off by asking them, what did the Aichi targets mean to them? And most of these businesses these businesses were clued up on the SDGs. They all reported it under the big businesses reporting on the SDGs. The Aichi targets they kind of heard of, but they didn't really resonate with them at all. And a lot of that was about the kind of language that we use. And I think we write in certain ways and styles which speak to us as a community, but don't speak to normal people, I think.
Because we're not normal.
Because we're not normal. But we're here, so why would you be inside on a lovely summer evening?
Okay, we are running out of time, I'm afraid. I think it has been extremely inspiring, the discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did. I would like to offer you the opportunity to say in 30 seconds some keywords, some last reflections on the matter, and then we will close, and then we will have some refreshments outside for those who could stay. Who wants to start? Last 30 seconds, please, sorry.
Thank you. I'd just like to emphasize that it's crucial that CBD is linked with CITES, and one of these ways can be through MB subs. Mexico has a very strong MB sub, and I recently, with one of my coworkers, did a matchup between what CITES can do regarding our MB sub, and we found that CITES is, or the implementation of CITES is linked with all 6 of our axes, which are knowledge, conservation, restoration, use, and sustainable use, attentions to drivers, education, and governance. The CITES can be linked to 14 of our lines of action and does directly impact 37 actions. It does not necessarily specify CITES, but we know CITES can have impact on research, on population studies, on ex situ conservation, on in situ conservation. So if I go through the whole list, there's a lot of opportunities for CITES to fit in there. So I think an MB sub can be a very useful tool moving forward with implementing CITES and the synergy with CBD.
Thank you very much. Carolina, do you want to say a few more words? Nothing about it?
No, I'll thank you for inviting me to this. I'm relatively new to the CBD world, and so I'm learning about the scope and the mandate of it, and so I find it, as been noted, our negotiations are different, our approaches are different, and so I find it really intriguing to look at the different approaches that 2 communities are taking to achieve biodiversity outcomes, and I think there's a lot to learn from that, and I haven't really in my own head articulated exactly how to put that together, but I do see the potential in there. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, thanks very much. I think we had the same experience, I think, in Egypt, or also in this sense. Diane, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just, on top of my mind, I would think of smart targets. We are now in a period where we are setting goals and targets. We hope that they are smart to monitor progress and reporting and monitoring what is about to come in 2030. So just make sure that you really present your targets and make sure that they are addressing those societal, economic drivers of biodiversity loss, and make sure that we don't regret this in 10 years and want to review this all over again.
Thank you very much.
Just quickly, I think we should be looking for some kind of target about overexploitation, perhaps, as we have been discussing here. But I think, so echoing earlier comments, really we have to look at the indirect drivers as well. And I think we're all talking about trying to get more resources going into biodiversity conservation or sustainable use. But the reality is, for every dollar that goes into biodiversity conservation, there's many times more dollars which are driving biodiversity loss. And I think if you look at Target 3 in the Aichi targets, which is about addressing perverse incentives, that's one of the targets that's made least progress. So I think you have to find some way of shifting that balance, and if you do, I think moving some of those perverse incentives into positive incentives can make a massive difference very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I don't want to keep everyone from drinks and food at all, I promise. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And the one thing I would leave with is, I shouldn't say that. This is my 12th Cites Cop, and I really appreciate that we're actually having this conversation at a Cites Cop. It's great. Myself and my WCS colleagues are here. We'd happy to discuss it with all of you over the next however many days we're still here in this windowless conference room, and look forward to working with you on CBD and CITES. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks also for inviting us to participate in this panel, and also to acknowledge that indeed this whole issue of synergies is at different levels. There's operational, there's implementation, and then there's sort of mandate level, and that we haven't really addressed some of the questions at the operational level where there are also real obstacles to improving synergies and collaboration. I think there's tools out there, but there's real challenges that need to be overcome as well.
Thank you. Anastasia?
I'm going to take it to 21st century and suggest hashtag I found wild, because I think thank you so much for having me. It's brilliant to discuss. I hope that parties move towards the post-2020 targets in a really constructive way. We really hope that wildlife trade and use does figure in it in a big way, because I think it needs all the help it can take, together with the benefits it generates. And this hashtag I found wild is something I'm personally trying to generate. I'm not very successful, not an influencer, but what I'm trying to say is understanding of what wildlife trade and use mean in our everyday life is such an entry point into understanding how to resolve issues around unsustainable and illegal trade. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So big thanks to all the panelists, to all the participants. I think it has been a very inspiring discussion. We really were committed to bring this discussion to the Cites Cop, and I'm now very happy about having been able to do that. I bring with me a lot of keywords and inspiring ideas. I think working together is good, it's possible, and it's needed. And working together at multilateral level, working together across governmental departments, working together to bring this global biodiversity framework to something that operates in the ground, that operates in the whole world, that works for all the different regions of the world, and that bring the next decade to a change in the way we interact with nature, so that future generations can enjoy the nature and can live in harmony with it. So thanks a lot to all, and as I said, we have some refreshments outside for those who could stay and further engage in the discussions. Thank you very much.